There is a monster in my room. I'm willing to bet every parent in the world has heard those 7 words countless times. Your children tell you, with absolute certainty, something sinister peers at them from the crack between the closet doors. A snarling beast hunkers just below their bed, waiting for them to close their eyes. Clawed fingers wrap deviously around the edge of a rocking chair in their corner. God forbid you let a foot or hand hang over the edge of the mattress in the dark. They wait, they watch, they hunger. We roll our eyes for the 1,000th time as we wipe away their tears and reassure them that there is nothing there. Fearlessly, we stride into the room and flip on the light switch and go on our monster hunt. Our children will stand sheepishly at the door as we crawl on hands and knees to show them that the monster under the bed is just a cluster of toys they hid rather than put away. What about the lurking beast behind the rocking chair? Only a heavy winter coat we forgot to hang up when we got home. The closet, though. The closet. We all know monsters love the closet. That one has to be real. Just the glass eye of a teddy bear reflecting the gleam of the nightlight across the room. To my adult knowledge, monsters weren't real. Until they were. The man with 3 yellow eyes. He is real. I'm sick just typing out these words. Laugh if you need to, but pay attention. Things aren't as simple as I always thought they were. If you have children and they plead with you to search their room for monsters, do it. Clay told me there was a monster in his room. He was right. Clay, our son, was born prematurely. My wife, Sasha, developed viral pneumonia around the 28th week mark of her pregnancy. She spent 2 weeks in the hospital for observation. We were a bit older when we had Clay, and her doctors were concerned that age and illness would provide additional complications. There were some scary moments, but after 14 days, the doctors called and told me I could bring her home. I still remember how eager I was to leave work and to pick her up. The house was so damn lonely without her there. Clay had other plans. Preterm labor is an uncommon but not unheard of side effect with pneumonia during pregnancy. As I drove to the hospital that day to pick her up, Sasha began to have contractions. Her doctors gave her a cocktail of medications intended to delay the delivery, but they didn't get the job done. With this being our first pregnancy, I didn't understand how dire the situation was. "We've done everything we can," Dr. Holland told me when I arrived at the hospital. "The neonatal intensive care unit is on standby when your son arrives. We will do everything we can to keep him and your wife safe and healthy." "They'll be all right, though," I said, voice unsteady. "Won't they?" Dr. Holland did his best to reassure me. Intellectually, I understand that early delivery wasn't ideal. The following weeks were a terrible education into just how trying it could be. Labor was rough, for lack of a better term. Sasha was in a great deal of pain for hours. She had dilated to a point the doctors felt like the baby would come any moment, but he didn't. After an exam, Dr. Holland told us Clay was asynclitic. He was head down in the birth canal, but his head was tilted onto his shoulder, keeping him from coming out. They prepped Sasha for a C-section and rolled her out of the room. We walked hand in hand with each other until a firm but kindly nurse placed her hand on my chest and held me in place. They wheeled her through the door and down the hall to a delivery room. I tried to push past her, but she stepped in front of me. "I'm going to take you to a waiting room," she said in a soft but unmistakable firm voice. "They are in good hands. We will bring you in to see them when the doctor is finished." Grooved ridges of a quarter brushed against my thumb and the second joint of my index finger as I turned it over and over nervously. My last cigarette had been 10 years earlier, but my brain reminded me just how much nicotine would calm my nerves just then. If my wife and son weren't down the hall in such a precarious position, I would have run a mile for a single choking draw. I was pacing when the same stoic nurse that stopped me from pursuing my wife returned. There was a smile on her previously stern face, and my thundering heartbeat subsided a bit. "Let's go meet your son," she said soothingly. Our boy came into this world weighing just under 3 pounds and with a set of underdeveloped lungs. He spent a month and a half in the neonatal intensive care unit, hooked up to so many pads and wires that I get anxious just thinking about it now. He was so small, like a baby bird, so fragile but fighting like hell to thrive. Thrive, he did. After his discharge, we went home and hunkered down. Being a first-time parent in my 30s, it was a difficult adjustment. Clay had colic and would wail into the small hours of the night. Sasha was still struggling with postpartum depression, so I tended to take the night shifts to give her a bit of a break. He slept in a small bassinet by the bed, and I would scoop him up quickly before rocking him in the living room recliner. We would glide back and forth in the overstuffed chair and he would cry. Little by little, though, his eyes would get heavy and he would drift back to sleep. I would stay in the chair and just smile at him as he slept. He was my little miracle. The first time I can recall Clay mentioning the man with 3 yellow eyes was a few months after he turned 3. Even in his big boy bed, we still kept a baby monitor pointed at him. His health had been so frail when he was born that the fear for his well-being never quite drifted away. Everything was fine until the baby monitors began to malfunction. At first, the screen would crackle with static. White and gray pixels danced and the speaker would crackle. After a few moments of interference, the monitor would bloom back to life and I could see Clay sleeping soundly. As the weeks and months passed, the interference with the monitor increased. The picture would vanish for minutes at a time and the static would be overwhelming. My ears would fill with a high-pitched wail. I tossed the monitor in the trash and purchased a newer, nicer version at the store. In my mind, I chalked the malfunction up to having purchased an inexpensive device from Amazon. The new one was a bit more complicated, but the reviews were stellar, and I felt confident it would do the job. No such luck. It hadn't taken long to install the new camera in Clay's room and to set up the new monitor. He had drifted off to sleep in his bed watching as I attached the new device to the wall above his bed. I watched as his chest rose and fell. His sleep had been fitful, and it was a relief to see him sleeping so soundly. Not 30 minutes after I dropped my head onto the pillow in my bed, the brand new monitor began to crackle and pop. Whites, grays, and blacks danced across the screen as the view of my son disappeared. I cursed under my breath and reached a hand out to tap the monitor screen when an explosion of noise burst from the speakers. Clay was shrieking. Blood-curdling wails poured from the speaker and from the hallway. Sasha and I sprang into action, tossing the covers to the floor and darting down the hallway. I pushed his door open, unsure of what I may find there. My wife turned on the light and we scanned the room. There was nothing out of place. Clay sat upright in his bed. Tears streamed down his deep red face. His eyes were clenched shut, and he was still screaming at the top of his lungs. Balls of the blanket were gripped firmly in his hands as we approached his bed. Sasha reached out to touch his shoulder.
"Clay, we're here, baby. What's wrong?"
He continued to wail as my wife shook him gently. I paced frantically behind her as she tried to soothe him and gain his attention. Sasha was always the much more comforting of the two, while I held down the worry and anxiety for the both of us. I wanted to help, but his sheer terror made me feel powerless.
"I don't know what's wrong with him,"
my wife said, her eyes filling with tears. I walked past my wife and lifted my son from the bed. He began to kick violently as I pulled him against my chest. His tiny heart thundered against me, and I could feel his cold tears soaking into my shirt. After a few moments of trying to push himself away, his body began to relax and he put his cheek on my shoulder. Looking at his face, I could see his eyes were open, red from tears.
"You okay, buddy?"
I asked in a soothing tone. His breathing was evening out, and his loud sobs had dampened to faint sniffling.
"What scared you?"
Clay put his head up and turned to face the window in his bedroom. He lifted his tiny hand and pointed toward it. Fresh tears began streaming down his face, and he struggled to find the words.
Eyes.
He whimpered.
Yellow eyes.
Over the next year, Clay had recurring night terrors involving the man with yellow eyes. His nighttime bouts of screaming and tears became a weekly occurrence. I repeated the same ritual of holding him closely and bouncing him until he went to sleep again. When he drifted back off, I would slide him back into his bed and pull the covers over his tiny body. On those nights, I would settle into the rocking chair in the corner of his room in case he woke up in a panic again. He never did, though. As his vocabulary grew, so did the description of the man with yellow eyes. Clay would tell us, almost whimsically over breakfast, that it, was a skinny man about my height with bright yellow eyes. He was all black like a living shadow with no distinguishing features. It wasn't until 4 months after the first nightmare that the yellow eyes became 3 yellow eyes.
It's just a nightmare,
Sasha said, placing a bowl of cereal in front of Clay. He happily shoveled spoonfuls of the sugary puffs into his mouth.
The man with 3 yellow eyes watches me sleep,
Clay replied, mushy crumbs dribbling out of his mouth as he chewed through the words.
His eyes are bright. They wake me up.
I read the newspaper as I listened to the exchange. My mind was always foggy after those nights in the rocking chair. I suspected sleeping in the hard chair didn't help my aging back. My muscles would ache like I was recovering from the flu, but it seemed a small price to comfort our son.
He blinks,
Clay said after some time.
His eyes blink?
I asked, half asleep as my eyes glazed over the sports column.
If he's got 3 of them, I'd say he blinks a lot.
Sasha pulled the newspaper from my hands and swatted me playfully on the head. I looked at her and smirked, and she gave me a lovingly disapproving glare. It wasn't a good idea to joke with Clay about something that scared him so much, and I immediately felt awful.
What do you mean he blinks?
I asked.
The eyes? No,
Clay responded and slid out of his chair. He walked toward me and stood about a foot away. His arms dropped to his side and his body went stiff. He looked into my eyes as his body began to twitch. For a moment, I was concerned he was having a seizure.
He moves like this. Okay,
Sasha exclaimed. She walked over to Clay and scooped him up.
That's enough about the man with 3 yellow eyes for today. You and I are heading to Grammy and Papa's house today, and we need to get packed.
Clay squealed with delight as she carried him down the hall toward his room. I could hear them laughing as I gathered the dishes and put them in the sink. The vision of my son violently twitching as he told me about the 3-eyed man swam through my mind like an old song lyric. I didn't want to think about how uncomfortable it made me, but the more I fought it, the deeper the roots slipped into my brain. Sasha and Clay were going to spend a week with their parents out of state. While I usually joined them for the visit, there were quite a few things I needed to get done around the house. With both of them gone, it would be easier for me to finish my projects and sink into a bit of relaxation in a quiet house. It would also leave me time for a special project that I hoped would help Clay sleep better at night. While they were away, I planned to sleep in Clay's bedroom. No part of me believed that a shadow man with 3 glowing yellow eyes was real, but I had hoped that maybe I would discover some environmental factor. Perhaps there was some everyday item in his room that Sasha and I had never noticed. If I could figure it out, I thought, we could get Clay past his fear and all of us on to peaceful nights of sleep. I packed their suitcases into the car before noon and kissed my wife and son goodbye. The drive would be 3 hours long, and I reminded Sasha over and over to call often so I knew they were okay. She assured me they would update me regularly. Clay was already sleeping soundly in the back, a much-deserved nap after his difficult night. Waving to them as they passed out of sight at the end of the street, I headed into the house to begin my week of home repairs and decluttering. I remember hoping that Clay's visit with his grandparents would also be a vacation away from the man with 3 yellow eyes, that he would rest well and leave the imaginary beast here with me. My hope came true, and things have never been the same since. The shower head dripped slowly as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror. Another thing to fix, I thought to myself, before they come back. Most of the day had been spent clearing years' worth of junk out of the garage. Sasha wasn't a hoarder, but she certainly flirted with the idea. Nothing was garbage until it hadn't been used for years. I had taken the chance while she was away to haul some things to the dump. The hot shower from the leaky faucet had been my end of the day reward. After tossing on a pair of shorts and a ratty old shirt, I padded down the hall toward Clay's bedroom. Standing at the door, I gazed at the twin bed and rolled my eyes. At well above 6 feet tall, his bed wouldn't provide me with the most comfortable night of sleep I ever had, but it was a small price to pay. I assumed that sleeping in there for a few nights may help me solve the mystery. Pushing back the blanket covering his bed, I slid under the covers and tried fruitlessly to adjust my large frame on the twin mattress. My head and feet pressed against the wood frame of the bed, causing them to creak in disapproval. After a few moments of fidgeting and adjusting, I managed to settle in and find some measure of comfort. I laid there staring at the red numbers on the alarm clock beside the bed. It was 11 p.m., and I began to feel sleep washing over me. After 2 hours of inspecting Clay's room in the dark of night, there didn't appear to be any environmental factors that would cause him to think he saw some dark creature with 3 eyes watching him sleep. My eyes struggled to stay awake under the cinder block pressure of exhaustion, and I knew I would fall asleep soon. Just as my eyelids began to slide closed, I looked toward the window a final time. Looking back at me from the darkness were 3 yellow eyes. With a shock, I jolted up, and the 3 yellow dots vanished. My head darted from side to side trying to find them again, but they were gone. It must have been my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. You came here expecting to see something. Why are you surprised? For a moment, I sat breathing heavily and laughing internally for letting myself get wrapped up in this boogeyman hunt. My ragged drags of air calmed, and I could no longer feel the throbbing of my pulse in my temple. In the darkness, I let out a loud laugh, amused at how wrapped up in the boogeyman hunt I had become. When I placed my head back on the pillow, the 3 yellow eyes slowly reappeared. My pace quickened again, but I forced myself to focus on them. The sudden scare had brought my mind back into focus. As I looked toward the 3 yellow orbs floating in the darkness, I saw that the security light at the back of the house was able to make its way through 3 holes in the window blinds. There was a privacy hedge outside my son's window that blocked almost all of the light except for that small area. Some nocturnal animal must have triggered the security light once or twice a week, and my son wakes up to 3 pinholes of light. In his sleepy haze, he sees a shadow man with glowing eyes watching him sleep. A sense of pride and relief washed over my body as I watched the 3 dots of light filter through the blinds. It was something tangible to show Clay when he got home. He would finally understand there was no malevolent creature standing in the darkness of his room. Only 3 small holes in his blinds that I would cover after I showed him. I could hardly wait to call Sasha in the morning and tell her that we could put this all behind us. With no need to spend the rest of the night curled up on a twin mattress, I grabbed my cell phone from the bedside table and threw my legs over the side of the bed. That same flu-like ache drifted up my back, much like it did after the nights of sleeping in the rocking chair. A tinnitus buzz filled my ears as well, and a vertigo sensation washed over my mind. I sat on the edge of the bed for a few moments, waiting for the cocktail of sudden maladies to pass, but they intensified. Only 5 minutes before, I had felt fine, but my body had become a symphony of pain and confusion. With some effort, I pushed myself unsteadily from the bed to make my way to the bathroom. My stomach was starting to churn, and I felt as though I may vomit at any moment. As I turned to walk to the door, I saw a black silhouette blocking the exit. The dull glow of a hallway nightlight framed the dark figure. I froze in place as 3 yellow slits slowly opened, looking in my direction. My frozen posture melted away as a primal survival instinct surged through my body. a bestial scream erupted from my mouth, and I charged toward the dark figure, preparing to throw my body weight against it and escape the room. As I drew closer, the tinnitus ringing in my head intensified. I stumbled and fell to my knees, hands covering my ears in an attempt to stop the hellish noise. My stomach rolled again, and I violently retched onto the hardwood floor. Throbbing pain erupted from my back, and a pinpoint of white-hot agony bloomed in the center of my forehead. Through the overwhelming misery, I opened my eyes and looked toward the thing. Its black frame blocked the doorway. 3 sickening yellow eyes peered down at me as the creature's body convulsed. It almost seemed to rattle in place, as though it were a television set trying to refocus the picture.
He blinks,
Clay had said. He was right. The thing blinked in and out of existence. A few times each second, it would vanish and reappear just inches from where it had stood. I thought to myself through the haze of agony that it looked like it had no anchor to existence. It fought with every ounce of its hateful existence just to tower above me in the doorway. The ringing sirens in my ears only intensified as I looked into those hateful eyes. Fresh vomit poured from the corners of my mouth, and I prayed silently that I would just die. Anything to release me from that suffering. Was this what Clay felt? I asked myself. My poor son. I could feel hot blood running from my nose. The copper taste filled my mouth, mixing with the hot bile and bringing on a new wave of nausea. Just as my vision began to darken, the man with 3 yellow eyes began to step forward, black body jerking violently. It lifted its hand toward my head as the ringing in my ears swelled to a crescendo. As the tremendous pain in my forehead exploded, everything went black. I awoke the next morning in my bed. Bright sunshine pierced through the windows, reigniting my dormant headache. After a few moments of staring at the ceiling, all of the events from the previous night flooded back into my mind. My pulse jumped as I sprung from the bed and ran down the hall toward Clay's room. I pushed open the door and my heart nearly stopped. Everything was just as it should be. His bed was neatly made, just as Sasha had always left it. The fragrance of vanilla bean and linen drifted through the air from the oil diffuser on top of his dresser. Every inch of the hardwood floor gleamed, free of the blood and vomit that I was so certain would be there in dried puddles. I raced to the kitchen and opened the lid of the trash can, looking for any signs of paper towels used to clean up the mess. It sat empty. After a brief search, I found all of the cleaning supplies in the cupboard, neatly lined in place. My eyes trailed down to my t-shirt, free of the rivers of blood I was certain had poured from my nose during the night. Nothing was out of place, but it felt all wrong. My body still ached, and my head swam with delicate bolts of pain. When I placed my hand on my forehead, low heat radiated. I was running a fever. A quick check with the thermometer showed a temperature of 103.1. I told myself it had all been a fever dream. The rest of the afternoon was spent at a walk-in clinic. Flu swabs, COVID tests, strep panels, every basic test they could think of. But they didn't find anything wrong with me other than the high fever and aches. I walked out with a prescription for a generic antibiotic and directions from the doctor to take ibuprofen, drink liquids, and get some rest. I spent the rest of the week sleeping in Clay's room, trying to reproduce the horrible scene from that night. Nothing unusual happened again. Each passing night was equally reassuring as it was maddening. The vision or nightmare had been so vivid, I couldn't believe it had all been in my head. A high fever could certainly cause hallucinations, but it felt so damn real. When Sasha called, I didn't mention what I had seen. She was worried when I told her I was sick and offered to come home early, but I told her to stay. They hadn't seen her parents since the holidays, and I didn't want to be the cause of an early departure. It would give me a chance to rest up and shake the bug, I assured her. She reluctantly agreed. At the end of the week, I felt a bit better. Not completely back to normal, but enough that I felt certain I had shaken whatever bug had taken over my body. I stood in the driveway to greet Sasha and Clay as they pulled in late Sunday evening. We carried in the bags as Sasha and Clay happily chatted about their adventure to Grammy and Papa's house. He never mentioned the man with 3 yellow eyes. Before Clay went to sleep, I told him that I had slept in his bed while he was gone and discovered the source of the man with 3 yellow eyes. He listened intently as I explained the holes in his blinds and how the security light on the back porch would shine through. Clay smiled at me happily. I don't know if he believed me, but I hoped it would help him sleep better at night. I almost mentioned my nightmare but stopped myself. It confused me why I would be compelled to tell my previously terrified child about that horrible vision. I had just given him some peace of mind, but in my foolishness, I nearly took it all away. And yet, I still wanted to tell him even as I pulled the door closed behind me. As Sasha and I lay in bed that evening, I tossed and turned. She asked if I was okay, and I told her my back still hurt a bit from the illness. It was a lie. I couldn't get the image of that hellish, yellow-eyed monster out of my mind. The idea of my son sleeping in that room gnawed at my brain like a tumor. As I shifted in bed, I heard Sasha begin to snore. I slipped out of the bed and went into Clay's room to check on him. He was sleeping soundly in the soft glow of his nightlight, a stuffed bear held tightly under his arm. The air in the room smelled rich with vanilla bean and linen oil, but a strange tang of copper seemed to accompany it. I pushed the thought out of my mind and smiled at my son from the doorway. Looking at the clock, I saw it was 9:30 p.m.
Walk over and check on him,
a voice in my head said.
Just watch him sleep for a bit. It will make you feel better.
My footsteps made the floorboards creak as I made my way to his bedside. I thought the sound would wake him, but he didn't move. The only movement was the rises and falls of his back, and he breathed in and out. Watching the movement was hypnotizing. I started to count them as my head became cloudy. For a moment, I thought I would fall asleep as I counted his breathing in my mind. Blinking rapidly to wake myself, I decided it was time to get back in bed. Gazing down at his clock, I was startled to see it was 11 p.m. I had watched my sleeping son in bed for an hour and a half, though it seemed like only moments had passed. Confused, I left the room and crawled back into the bed with Sasha. As I lay there with my eyes closed, I thought about going back to watch him sleep, just for a few more minutes. I pushed the thought away and made myself go to sleep. Over the next few weeks, I found myself going to Clay's room each night after Sasha went to sleep. I would stand over his bed for hours at a time, counting the rises and falls of his chest. It was the only time at night I felt normal. Whenever I would stretch out in my bed, my back would begin to ache and a dull throb would swell in my brain until it focused on a fine point in the center of my forehead. Sweat would pour from my brow until I stumbled to his room. His rhythmic breathing was soothing. All my aches and worries would drift away as he slept below my gaze. It felt intoxicating. Sasha was unexpectedly called out of town for an overnight work trip. She apologized profusely for the short notice, but I assured her it would be no issue. Clay was a low-maintenance kid, and we would have a fun boys' night in. The night she left, I stood over his bed again. My head swam as I watched him breathe evenly in the dull glow of his nightlight. I was startled from my stupor one night when Clay began to move around in his bed. He had never woken up any of the times I stood over him, watching him sleep. His eyes jolted open when he noticed me, and he stared up at me in fear. For a moment, I thought of giving him some words of comfort, to assure him I was just there to make sure he was safe. But I said nothing. My gaze intently locked with his. I remained still. Clay began to wail in fear, but I was unmoved. I knew I should comfort him, but I felt angry that he had woken up. His tears and cries melted into a ringing in my head that seemed to shake my bones. My body shook uncontrollably as pain radiated from my back and the familiar piercing agony bloomed on my forehead.
Put your hand on his head,
A voice rang in my head.
your touch will calm him.
The vice grip pressure in my head felt ready to erupt when I reached out a shaking hand toward my son. He cried and moved away, but I continued forward. The voice continued to tell me it would calm him, reassure him. Once more, my vision went black. It has been 6 months since that terrible array of nights. Clay never mentioned waking up to find me standing above his bed. My strange symptoms have never returned. I no longer feel compelled to watch him sleep during the night. He never mentions the man with the 3 yellow eyes anymore either. I would like to think that my explanation about the security lights calmed his mind. It would be a comfort to think everything was just some inexplicable nightmare that we both shared. Any comfort would be nice. None of it is true. Last night, I woke up at 11 p.m. with a ringing in my ears. When I turned over to ask Sasha if she heard anything strange, I saw Clay standing beside the bed. He was watching his mother sleep, his body twitching. His eyes were a dull yellow and a small light was beginning to shine on the center of his forehead. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out some more of my episodes here.